Welcome to Day 2 Project Podcast. Today's episode is a short conversation with my son Jonathan on the subject of IMF. We all have heard enough conspiracies about global financial organizations like International Monetary Fund, also known as IMF, and World Bank. Do they exist to turn the world into a giant marketplace by growing the global economy indefinitely? They claim they promote international financial stability, facilitates international trade, promotes employment and sustainable economic growth, and helps reduce global poverty. How true are these claims? Let's take a look at how these institutions operate and some benefits and pitfalls of their existence. Jonathan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Do you want to start by introducing yourself?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Jonathan Manjasseril. I'm in 9th grade. I currently attend Hazlitt High School. The reason we started discussing this topic for the podcast was because I started doing debate a little bit ago, maybe a month ago, and the current public forum topic is the IMF currently beneficial? Or does it have negative implications? So we just thought that was interesting.
So we are going to talk about IMF. Do you want to start by giving an introduction to what IMF is? Because I have heard about IMF, World Bank, United Nations, and all these global institutions, but I don't know much about it. So today I'm going to be mostly let you do most of the talking. Hope I can ask you the right questions. So do you want to start by giving a brief introduction of what IMF is, what IMF stands for, and what is its function, how it started, things like that?
Okay, so the IMF is a financial institution, and its main goal is to provide economic stability to regions or countries. The IMF's idea was first proposed and formed in 1944 in the Bretton Woods Conference by two people. It was formally introduced to the public in 1945, and the reason they made the IMF is because the Second World War really brought upon a huge economic shock. So they needed something to recover out of this economic instability. So they decided to create the IMF as a financial institution in order to help out these countries that are struggling.
So when you said they, who are they?
It started with political and global leaders. And these people at the time, they just knew that the economy needed something or just anything to help them climb out of what they were in right now. So they decided to start this institution. And now what I'm saying as they is now 190 countries. So it's grown into quite a large body, and it's quite a big institution.
So IMF stands for what?
International Monetary Fund.
It's international because it constitutes representations from 190 countries.
Around the world, yeah. And then monetary fund, so they're providing money in loans, and this provides these countries need to pay back these loans once they have what it takes and they're out of these recessions or this instability.
When I grew up in India, we heard a lot about the government borrowing money from institutions like IMF, World Bank, etc. Is these two different institutions, or is IMF same as World Bank?
The IMF and the World Bank, they are closely linked, but they are not the same institution. They were both formed in the same conference, the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944. But so the IMF, they have quotas, right? So countries that pay most money in a money pool for the IMF spending budget or loaning budget, these countries have the most power in making decisions. So the World Bank, it doesn't really work like that because that just furthers socioeconomic inequality. So the World Bank is comprised of 5 institutions, and it's not, okay, if one institution pays more money than the other, they have more power in making decisions. They're not the same.
So the primary difference between IMF and the World Bank is, so IMF is funded by its members, which are these 190 countries. They are the source of money. So they bring money to the pool, and IMF uses that money from the pool. So whoever bringing more money has more power or more say at the table.
Right.
Okay. So basically the operating model is slightly different for IMF and World Bank, right? You said that this was formed after Second World War. So I am assuming this was a direct response to stabilize the world economies, especially Europe, which was mostly affected by the Second World War, which was driven from the Great Depression beforehand, right? So towards the end of the World War II, of course, many countries around the world tried to protect their assets by cutting down the trade deals with other countries.
Exactly.
This also impacted the global economy. And so many world leaders thought that an international body like an international bank, for example, they originally, I think, started by making an international bank which will oversee the financial transactions, the trade agreements between countries, etc., would help to prevent future financial meltdowns like Great Depression.
The idea of the wars, right? They wanted a world economy or globalization. They wanted to make trading free in order for wars not to occur as often. Because if one country is continuously obtaining resources that is necessary for their society to survive from another country, if they go to war with that country, they won't be able to obtain those resources. So the idea of globalization was partly to make these countries reliant on each other so that if one country goes, these countries know that they won't be able to go to war with one another and at the same time support their economy.
Yeah, let's say Indonesia, for example. So Indonesia, whatever the goods and services they produce, if they depend on another country like India for their supply chain, of course, they don't want to go to war with India because that will affect their economy also.
Yeah.
That was the primary motivation behind creating these global organizations such as IMF, World Bank, and United Nations. All three came into existence around the same time period. Hey, do you want to know a fun fact about IMF? The chief economist of IMF is from India. Not only from India, she is from Kerala. Her name is Geeta Gopinath. And she was an advisor to the Chief Minister of Kerala prior to her role as the Chief Economist of IMF. When I looked at their wiki page, I was quite impressed with seeing somebody like her.
That's super cool, yeah.
Yeah. So let's move on to a question about, so you mentioned there are 190 countries as members of IMF. What is my incentive to become a member of IMF?
When you're a country, right, in a world economy, you want as much power as you can get. So if you're a member of the IMF, you have the power to make decisions, financial decisions about all the other countries that need loans. So for example, there are 24 board members, right? So the economies that have devoted most to the quota, one country, like the US, they're the ones that has the biggest quota right now. So one person of the US gets one board member. But that obviously can't be the case because there's not 190 board members. In certain situations, countries that maybe are not able to devote as much to the IMF, they're not as able to devote as much as the pool, like 10 countries are combined into one board director, and those 24 board directors literally a drastic influence on the world's economy. So if you're part of the IMF and you're able to gain economic stabilization and then devote to these quotas, you'll have the power to make decisions about the world as a whole.
Yeah, and also you have the power to borrow money from the pool when you have a need.
Exactly.
Okay. So basically access to information on economic policies, opportunity to influence other members with whatever the policies that they want to establish. A lot of banking, exchange matters, financial support in times of payment difficulties, and more importantly, more opportunities for trade and investment. So these are all the benefits the members get. Oh, here is another fun fact I learned researching this topic. Historically, the IMF's managing director has always been a European citizen. And the president of the World Bank has always been an American citizen.
Oh, okay.
So that's like the agreement between these two organizations. And interestingly, these two organizations headquartered in Washington, D.C., and their offices are just across the street.
Yeah, they're really in close proximity to each other, and they're very closely linked to each other. In fact, the IMF has borrowed money periodically from the World Bank in times of necessity.
Okay. Talking about debt, right? So if I am a member of IMF and I have financial struggle or my currency is in trouble, so I borrow money from IMF. Is it always good to borrow money?
No, absolutely not. For one, a lot of these countries that go into these states of having a bad currency, it's literally just because of a corrupt government. Like Zimbabwe. The Zimbabwe government, the president, he wanted to temporarily make the economy prosper. So if you're gonna like print out more money or just supply more money to the economy for maybe a couple of weeks or months, the economy is gonna be like perfect. But after that, the currency it'll just go terribly. And that's where hyperinflation occurs. A lot of the reason hyperinflation occurs is because of these corrupt governments. So when these corrupt governments borrow money from the IMF, it's not because they're doing it for the good of the group. They're not doing it for their country. They're doing it to temporarily influence the economy in a positive way. And when these citizens, especially when these citizens are ignorant to what these leaders are doing, it's a political fight. So these people will vote for this corrupt government member because, the economy temporarily improved. They're just going to go further into debt. Look at Argentina. Argentina has constantly needed to borrow money from the IMF because the IMF just puts them further into debt.
So Argentina is in trouble?
Yeah, Argentina's in trouble. Yeah.
So what are some of the other countries who has borrowed the most money from IMF?
I don't necessarily know about borrowing like the most money, but a lot of countries within the African region, because Africa is, a lot of its areas are developing and they need help in order to get their economy out of recession or just improve their economy. Ecuador, recently, they had a financial crisis and they had to borrow money. And because they borrowed this money and the economy went into such a bad state, people in Ecuador actually rioted. And rioting and the pandemic, they're not a good mix because it's just
so why are they rioting?
They know that when this country is borrowing money, it's not for them because it's overall going to make the GDP go down. And there's a stat that says when the GDP goes up by 1%, it's a global stat, it's a global statistic. When the GDP goes up by 1%, the poverty rate goes down by 1.7%. So the GDP goes down, you can guess what happens. So these Ecuadorian people, they're rioting because they know that it's already a bad standard of living in Ecuador, and it's just going to make this standard worse. So the IMF has definitely had negative implications upon many countries, and it's not always puppies and rainbows, please.
Why is people against countries borrowing money? Is it because of environmental impact or privatization?
Okay. Obviously, environmental impacts. Because something that a lot of countries immediately turn to when they're facing a debt that they need to repay is commercial deforestation. And let's talk about Africa, right? So the World Rainforest Movement, I think it found, it was 70% of Africans rely on natural resources, including lumber. So when this region is just tearing down what they need, what they rely on to live, obviously it's not a good look for the IMF because, the IMF is technically what's causing it, even though the governments are handling it.
So I want to get to the bottom of it. So IMF is causing deforestation because IMF is influencing the government's policies to expand their infrastructure, which would require deforestation. Is that what you're saying? Or are they using deforestation as a means of paying back to IMF?
Yeah, I think it's the second one. Because what they do is they impose strict policies within these countries. These 24 board members are literally influencing the lives of billions of people. They get to decide the policies of interest and loans. They base that off of how these countries have paid back loans in the past. So these countries just turn toward deforestation or building more factories, which attributes to climate change. Another big thing that's like with a bad thing about the IMF is that, or a bad thing in a lot of people's like minds, is that when the IMF imposes these policy loans, what do these countries turn to? So one is harming natural resources. Second one is social spending cuts, education, healthcare, further taxation. And this has a huge impact on the citizens of our region because, first of all, educational cuts. These people are like literally the next generation. So they need this education. Healthcare cuts. It's killing millions of people. And then further taxation is just influencing the economy as a whole. So when these countries turn toward this, they do this in order to pay back loans that the IMF has set policies on, because they need to pay back these loans or like further interest rates. So that's like a bad thing according to some people. What is the alternative to austerity? Because first of all, wouldn't austerity occur anyway if this country doesn't receive help? If they're going to go into an economic recession, what are they going to do? Like the Great Depression, what did people do? I think it's worse personally than temporary austerity. The alternative to austerity is literally just an economic recession. There's a saying, it's like you receive a medicine. No matter if that medicine tastes bad or if it hurts your stomach for a couple of days or it just makes you feel bad for a couple of days, you eat the medicine because it's going to help you overall. That's what austerity is, because first of all, it's going to happen either way. And second of all, if the country plays their cards right, it'll overall have a beneficial implication.
One interesting fact about the money. So I always wondered that how much money is actually there in the world. So I looked at it. Is debt considered money? Because many people think debt is a tool, a fiscal tool that individuals and countries and institutions can use in order to build capital. But the interesting fact about money is the total world GDP is about 80 trillion. Okay. So there is 80 trillion dollars in the world. But do you know how much debt is there in the world? 280 trillion, which is 355% of global GDP, which is about 3.5 times. Yeah. So the total debt in the world is 3.5 times more than the total money in the world. So I don't know how all these countries keep borrowing and increasing the deficit, how they are able to going to pay it back at some point.
If you want to talk about how the IMF has impacted economies, if you're looking at the overall picture, it's negative. It paints a negative portrait of the IMF. But I think a huge part of what these countries do, or what these countries have, is literally just desperation. Because they know our economy, or their economy, is going to move into worse times. So they look at these countries like Vietnam, who had 40 million people come out of poverty, and their poverty rate dropped from 60% to 14%. And they look at these countries like Korea, or South Korea. They came out of their biggest economic recession in 5 decades. And they were notable for the country that followed the IMF's advice the most. So they look at these countries and they're like, okay, we can become like them. But in most situations, it's super difficult to come out of this debt that the IMF has placed you in. I think a lot of it is really just desperation and wanting to have a chance to go back to your prior economy or prosper even more.
You mentioned some Asian countries. Is that the 1997 Asian financial crisis?
The 1997 Asian financial crisis was multiple countries given loans at the same time. Mm-hmm. And these countries, the policies were so strict that they weren't able to climb out of this debt. So one country was China. But look at China now. Right. They're one of the most influential, if not the most influential economies in the world. And I think you got to give credit right there to China and the IMF, because it shows that the IMF really can have positive benefits.
I'm curious to see if there is any country which benefited and improved their prosperity because of IMF. I think the only one country I can think of is South Korea.
South Korea, I think Vietnam is a pretty good example.
After the Vietnam War?
Yeah, they needed
bad
money.
Shape.
Yeah, they were in a bad shape.
Yeah, so speaking of countries, you said that there are only 190 members in IMF. Of course, there are more sovereign nations than 190. I think UN has about 193 nations. So which are some of the countries which are not part of IMF?
To give 2 examples, North Korea, they just have they're completely disconnected from all the other countries. And then Cuba, they're also a very strict country that doesn't like to associate themselves.
So Cuba is not associating with IMF. Is it because of the fact that they don't agree with the current global economic model, the capitalistic economic model? Of course, we know that there is a Western influence. The Western countries have an upper hand on IMF because you mentioned that the power of the director of board members is based on how much quota. So United States being the number 1 voting member of IMF, Of course, they have a more influence on the IMF policies. What about the potential collusion between corporations and IMF to implement some of these policies in developing nations?
The Western influence from the IMF is not an ethical thing, because capitalism, its basis is based on never running out of natural resources. So I think, especially with countries that have a more socialistic outlook on the world or the economy, I definitely think that those are the countries that are going to have the toughest time being in the IMF.
I always wonder that is there a story behind the story? When we hear about IMF, everything sounds good. If you look at their website, they are saying they exist because they want to make the world a better place and all that. But we need to sometimes go behind the scenes to not in a conspiratorial way. Everything that people talk about IMF, World Bank is not true. Some of it are simply false conspiracy theories. Let's say I'm a country, borrowed money from IMF, and I am hit by a huge natural disaster, such as Haiti, for example. They had a 2010 earthquake. So now they are in a position that they cannot pay back IMF. So does IMF execute any kind of debt forgiveness? Or in that situation, if a country cannot pay back, what do they do?
There was a quote by one of the leading members, and they said, "We are a financial institution, not a charity." So I think, in that example, they did not give debt relief.
Or there is some advantage to countries like US. For example, United States wanted a foothold in Pakistan to fight Taliban in Afghanistan. So during that time, IMF lent more money to Pakistan because United States has a special interest in that region. There are a lot of examples like that. So the other thing, there is a book written by I believe he was an ex-IMF employee. It's called The Confessions of an Economic Hitman. So these are the people who belongs to global financial consulting. They go to developing countries. In this case, he went to Indonesia. He studied the Indonesian economy and then create some policy suggestions for the Indonesian government. Okay. They submit these policy suggestions to the government, and since he is representing institutions like IMF, of course he has a big influence on the government. They would say that, we need to build this infrastructure. We need to build this huge electrical grid system around the country to improve the well-being of the population. However, if you look deeper, eventually all those contracts for building this infrastructure went to corporations which are rooted in either United States or one of the Western countries.
It's for their own benefit, yeah.
Yeah, so for their own benefit, right? So there is a potential collusion happening between corporations and entities like IMF and the political leaders or the governments, right?
Yeah. Well, there's an idea, it's a theory, it's painted in a negative way. It's called neoliberalism. Basically, what it's saying is deregulation, which is, in essence, taking away the power governments hold, quote-unquote, free market. But really what it does is further socioeconomic inequality. And it also cuts state spendings hugely, state social spending, in a massive manner. This idea was actually really positively taken in the beginning because the IMF endorsed this, and it led to some temporary economic growth. But in reality, it planted the seeds for a systematic crisis. A systematic crisis is one that affects not just one area or one region, it just affects the whole system, and that was the 2008 financial crisis.
So in a sense, are you suggesting that IMF is not necessarily a noble entity, or it's basically deepening the gap between rich and poor ultimately?
The view on IMF is opinionated, right? That's why, what I was saying about the public debate forum, that's why it's a resolution, because it's an opinion. But I do, in my personal opinion, believe that the IMF is not necessarily ethical. And it contributes to some factors which are really worsening our society as a whole. But currently, there are no alternatives. Because look at COVID, right? Mm-hmm. You look at this huge pandemic that just completely shocked the world economically and just overall, but it's contributed to a lot of countries that go towards economic stabilization. But look at what COVID did to the rich, right? The top 1% gained trillions of dollars off COVID. And that just goes to show that what even are these top 1% portraying about themselves to us, or what are they hiding?
The rich became more richer, the poor became more poorer. And these entities like IMF is not really helping to bring that gap closer.
I think it's furthering the gap, if anything.
So what do you think is a potential solution, right? You mentioned that when everything is said and done, IMF is causing more harm than good. So how can we improve? Can we improve IMF by maybe bringing more emerging markets and those countries into giving them more voting power and redistribute that concentrated power in most of the Western countries?
Exactly. So instead of having 24 board of directors and instead of having a quota, I think 190 board of directors is good. That may look at a lot, but look at this. They're determining the lives of billions of people. If anything, there should be like 5 board of directors per country, 5 political leaders in that country. Have 190 board of directors. Do not distribute the power in a way that richer countries are able to have more power in deciding what happens to countries that they are not even in. So I think that make it fair. Like when we look at the presidential elections, what is it, like the electoral college? In essence, get rid of that, but in terms of the IMF. You know?
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So then there is this question about who is doing most of the contribution to the resource pool. US is saying that they are contributing about 28% of the total fund of IMF. Of course, they will ask for more power. Right?
Exactly, but look at how they're contributing based on their economy. I'm sure this 22% of the pool from the US is nothing compared to 1% of the pool from, say, like Zimbabwe. So I think it should depend on how much they're contributing based on their economy. How much of their percent of their economy are they contributing to this pool? Because that shows more than anything like what you're willing to do. So I think it should just really depend on what in your country, what is your socioeconomic standing? And how much of your economy are you willing to give up to this pool of the IMF? That should determine power, if anything.
So in other words, make it more. Make IMF more democratized.
Yeah, it's just a question of justice.
Right, more democracy. Right,
Exactly.
it's always not only in politics. It works everywhere. Yeah, these are some of the interesting things that I lately learned because I wanted to ask you the right questions about IMF and how it operates. So I looked into it and it was fascinating to learn about this subject. Thank you so much for joining me today and sharing your thoughts, and hopefully we can come back with another topic in the future.
Yeah, definitely. It was really interesting to see how we could look into these things on a deeper perspective.
Thank you.
Yep, thank you.